bloodshed has returned. In Gaza, we've seen the most intense Israeli airstrikes for at least 7 years. The assault on densely packed neighborhoods has left scores dead, displaced tens of thousands, and destroyed dozens of homes.
Israeli airstrikes are reducing Gaza to rubble. Israel says a week and a half of this has decimated Hamas's tunnel network. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Hamas's military infrastructure has been set back years. But the infrastructure the people of Gaza depend on is also in ruin.
Recent violence between Israel and Palestine is making headwaves internationally, with much of the collective global community calling for peace. Violence erupted in Sheikh Jarrah, an Israeli-occupied territory in East Jerusalem, over an anticipated decision of the Supreme Court of Israel on the eviction of 6 Palestinian families. Under international law, the area, effectively annexed by Israel, is a part of the Palestinian territories that Israel currently holds under belligerent occupation. Protests quickly escalated into violent confrontations between Jewish and Palestinian protesters. On May 7th, Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, located on the Temple Mount, which is sacred in Judaism. The police used tear gas, rubber bullets, and grenades against stone-throwing Palestinians. The Supreme Court ruling was then delayed for 30 days as the Attorney General of Israel, Avichai Mandelblit, sought to reduce tensions. On May 10th, after Israel ignored an ultimatum to remove their forces, 2 Palestinian militant groups, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, began firing rockets into Israel from the Gaza Strip, hitting multiple residences and a school. Israel began a subsequent campaign of airstrikes against Gaza. Calls for a ceasefire were first proposed on the 13th of May by Hamas, but rejected by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. On 18th May, France, with Egypt and Jordan, announced the filing of a UN Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. But while this ensuing unrest continues unabated, we must ask ourselves, how did this happen in the first place? When we look at the state of Israeli-Palestinian relations today, we are quick to notice the images of chaos, violence, and destruction, not to mention the thousands who have died or been severely injured. But what we fail to realize is that the current wave of civil unrest is a byproduct of a much broader problem, one that continues to hinder any form of resolute peace between both states. And that is the topic of land laws and rights in the West Bank. Flash backwards to the 1870s, a Jewish trust bought Sheikh Jarrah from Arab landowners as the area was once a part of Ottoman Palestine. However, a group of Palestinians have disputed this event and have produced Ottoman-era land titles to prove their case. Regardless, an Israeli law allows Jews to file claims over land in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, if the land was once owned prior to 1948, but rejects Palestinian claims over land in Israel which they owned. The Israeli occupation of Sheikh Jarrah commenced after the country's historic victory during the 1967 Six-Day War. In 1972, Israel's custodian general registered the properties under Jewish trusts, which requested that all tenants meet rental payments. In the 1990s, eviction orders commenced after Palestinian tenants were unable to pay the rent on their properties. This was primarily due to rising rental payments. Meanwhile, many of the Israeli tenants did not experience this financial burden as the Israeli government subsidized their homes. The Jewish trusts sold the once Palestinian homes to a right-wing Jewish settler organization, which has since made repeated attempts to evict more Palestinian residents. Palestinian tenants argue that, since the land is outside Israel's recognized borders, Israeli courts have no jurisdiction there. Palestinians say that displacing tenants in this matter violates the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, particularly the statute's oversight of the crime of aggression. In 2002, settler groups succeeded in evicting 43 Palestinians from the area, with a further 3 families since then. In 2010, the Supreme Court of Israel rejected an appeal by Palestinian families who had resided in 57 housing units in Sheikh Jarrah, who petitioned the court to have their ownership of the properties recognized. However, an Israeli court did previously rule that Palestinians could remain on the properties as protected tenants but must pay rent. The move to evict them came after their refusal to meet rent payments, as well as their illegal construction on the properties. On May 10th, Israel's Supreme Court was expected to deliver a ruling on whether to uphold the eviction of 6 Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, after a court ruled that 13 families comprising 58 people must vacate the properties by 1st August. The current wave of subsequent violence has Political tensions in both Israel and Palestine have worked to worsen this current crisis. In Palestine, President Mahmoud Abbas delayed the country's legislative elections indefinitely in late April. He is widely seen as corrupt and leading an incompetent government. Many believe that his move was aimed at preventing Hamas from a potential victory at the polls in the West Bank. However, the current rocket fire from Gaza into Israel from Hamas is serving to advance their favorability amongst local Palestinians in the West Bank, wary of Abbas's political maneuvers. Meanwhile, the ongoing 2019-2021 Israeli political crisis has seen 4 inconclusive elections, which has left the country functioning under a caretaker government. Many perceive Netanyahu's extremely racist political stances against the Palestinians as indicative of a broader push to gain trust amongst far right-wing voters in Israel. Religious Zionism, or the desire for a Jewish state across the West Bank, remains fervent in Israel. The movement is being intensified by the Kark Party, a Jewish supremacist group widely described by the West as a terrorist organization. In a bid to preserve power at all costs, Netanyahu has been responsible for integrating such parties into the political mainstream. This need to stay in power comes as he faces a possible corruption conviction if he leaves office. In fact, the Kark Party's former leader, Rabbi Meir Kahane, was once frequently denounced by Netanyahu's predecessors, many of whom refused to sit in parliament when Kahane aired his grievances. To form a coalition with these Zionistic political parties, Netanyahu made several concessions, including providing parliamentary immunity to Jewish power leader Itamar Ben-Gvir to patrol Arab neighborhoods with police security, inflaming resentments. With the far right active and popular in both Israel and Palestine, the need for peace is being replaced by the desire for nationalism. Therefore, a combination of historical land law disputes and existing political tensions is responsible for this current wave of violence. But what can be done to halt the unrest? While there is no clear solution, both the proposed 1- and 2-state solutions outlined in previous negotiation efforts between Israel and Palestine offer a clear pathway to resolving this conflict. However, with the presence of political pandering to the far right, neither solution appears appealing to Israelis and Palestinians. However, if there is one side that is more capable of creating a long-lasting peace, it would be Israel. Palestine remains fractured between Hamas and Fatah, both of whom have issues of their own. Hamas, a terrorist organization, and Fatah, incompetent and corrupt. The result, a Palestine incapable of reaching the pinnacles of prosperity its neighbor Israel has reached. While I am not saying that Israel doesn't have problems of its own, it's important to note that the country is, at the end of the day, a liberal democracy. In the past, numerous Israeli leaders, whether it be Begin, Sharon, or Omer, have tried to make concessions for peace. Even though that political will might not be prominent in the government of today, it continues to live subconsciously in the minds of local Israelis who want peace. After all, Israel is a country built on the democratic principles of free speech, fair elections, the right to self-determination, etc. These principles are responsible for transforming Israel into the country that it is today. Given the country's economic might, but also its desire for justice and morality embedded within the nation's psyche, Israel can and must work to provide Palestinians the dignity that comes with having a nation of their own. For now, this prospect remains slim.